We've been talking about our youth quite a bit today and celebrating some of the things that God has been doing. It has been a really encouraging summer. First, it's just been really great to have Caleb Wilson join our team as our youth pastor. Josh has been carrying that dual load for about 2 years, and so I'm so thankful that we can give him this gift of being focused where he's at with creative arts and with our connections. And then Caleb has jumped in, and he is a quick learner, he is a hard worker, and he has such a heart for our youth. And so it just hasn't surprised me then to see God doing some really cool things with our youth this summer. We've experimented with doing more summer events, trying to keep better connected through the summer. And we've seen participation in that be really, really good. And then, my goodness, off the charts for kids going to camp. We have almost 30 going to mid-high camp this week and almost 20 going to senior high camp the next week. So in all, almost 50 kids going to camp, which I'm so thankful for. And then a couple weeks back when Caleb first came, and we said he's going to be taking over Cultivate Youth on Sundays. And so get your kids there so they can be building a relationship with him through the summer, so they're not starting at ground zero when fall launch happens. And you've responded to that. We had 20 in the Cultivate Youth this last Sunday. But I did want to take a moment to share about a shift in our strategy regarding Cultivate Youth. In the past, we've had Cultivate Youth for both mid-hires and then a separate group for senior hires. And moving forward, we're going to have just one Cultivate group, and it's going to be for mid-hires and then freshmen and sophomores. But we in a sense, we're going to be pushing the juniors and seniors out of the nest. We don't want them at that Cultivate group. We want to see them serving in the ministry of that church. And we want to see that for a number of reasons. I think one of the major errors of the evangelical church when it's come to its youth strategy over the past couple decades is that it's essentially been this. We want you to sit there and we are going to stuff you with as much truth as we can. All of this is well-intentioned, right? But we're going to stuff you with as much truth as we can before you go to college. All right? That falls short on a number of different fronts. One is that discipleship isn't just about information transfer. It's not just about knowing the church, knowing the truth. It's about our lives being changed. And as I read the Gospels, I see that you can't be like Jesus without serving. And you can't grow spiritually without serving. And when I look at the way Jesus discipled his disciples, he didn't just sit them in a classroom. He taught them along the way while he put them to work. And so if our youth are getting fed well at Thrive Wednesdays, which they have been, they're getting fed on Sunday mornings in our worship gathering, then they don't need another Bible study. What they need is an opportunity to serve, and they need an opportunity for them to experience God actually working through them so that they've experienced this truth that I have a part to play in this church before they go away to college. And I think about what would it be like to have our juniors and seniors involved in our kids' ministry. They would be absolute heroes to those kids, and they'd enjoy it, and they still have the energy to do kids' ministry. They'd be phenomenal volunteers. We have some very, very good musicians with our youth. Would love to see them part of the regular rotation up here where we have multiple generations that are represented up on this stage. Or they do a phenomenal job on the hospitality team making people feel welcome. But the key is we want them to experience that they have a part to play in this church. There's been so much work that's been done with the millennials not coming back to the church. And one of the big factors that those who have left us said, they just wanted me to sit there and learn, and I wanted to do something. Right? Again, God wired us to serve. And then at the last general conference that we had as a church last year, our new general superintendent, he made this point that just floored me. He said, if all we do is see discipleship in terms of information transfer, it's unlikely that we'll make a disciple. We're far more likely to make a Pharisee if it's all about information. And so we are still committed to handing on the truth to this next generation, but we also are going to give them opportunities to serve. Caleb is sounding the call with our youth, but parents, how about you partner with us? Because we think this is going to help their faith even be stickier and far more likely that they're going to come back to the church and play their part in it moving forward. All right, that being said, we see this in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6. This is a very, very important verse here. It says, and without faith, it is impossible to please God. That should cause us to sit up in our seats a bit. This lets us know the one essential ingredient to pleasing God. It's faith, and it's always been about faith. But this verse also begs the question, what is faith? I mean, what kind of faith is God looking for? Especially in our culture where faith is one of those mushy ideas and everybody has their own definition of what it is and what it means and what it looks like. That's why I'm so thankful for Hebrews 11, because not only does it tell us that faith is the essential ingredient to pleasing God, but it also shows us what real faith is. And it does it by giving us story after story after story of those who lived where their faith, God accepted it. They were commended by God because of their faith. And so it doesn't just tell us what real faith is, it shows us what real faith is. And there's so many areas in life where it's okay if you make a mistake or it's okay if you're wrong, but not this area. If we don't get what real faith is, we can't please God. That's why we're taking the summer to go through Hebrews 11. And actually, we're going through the first 23 verses of it because it's that section that covers the stories found in Genesis, first book of the Bible. These are the first followers of God. These are the originals. And so when we look at faith in their life, we're seeing classic faith. We're seeing faith in its original form. We're seeing vintage faith. And my hope and prayer is that as we go through this series and we see what their real faith looked like, that ours will mirror their faith more and more and more. Because when we look at their faith, we see that their faith, it wasn't just an emotion, it wasn't just a feeling, it was very tangible, very practical. It definitely impacted how they lived every day, not just Sunday, and it drove their everyday decisions. So I hope God help our faith become more like theirs. And we certainly saw the practicality of vintage faith when we looked at the stories of Abel and Enoch. Those are the first two inductees into this Hall of Fame of faith that we get in Hebrews 11. And we saw it also last week when we looked at the life of Noah. We saw that vintage faith obeys God. Very simple. But if you have real faith, vintage faith in God, when He calls you to do something, you do it. You don't hem, you don't haw, you don't hold God off at arm's length. You run with what He called you to do. And Noah did that. We saw that Noah obeyed God even when what God was calling him to do must have seemed absolutely crazy. Noah, I want you to build an ark about the size of 1.5 football fields, right? Because in 120 years, I'm going to flood the world. Must have seemed crazy, but Noah obeyed. And he obeyed even though it took him a long time to build that ark. It took a lot of time and a lot of hard work and the gathering of the animals and the gathering of the food, but he still obeyed. And Noah even obeyed, though he was the only one. I mean, literally, he was the last person on the planet who was still seeking and following God. But he showed us that's what vintage faith does. That was the hallmark statement of Noah's life. And Noah did everything as the Lord commanded him. And that'd be a pretty incredible epitaph, wouldn't it? You did everything that God called you to do. That's what I want to be true of my life. And so we're working through Hebrews chapter 11. And who's up next in the Hall of Fame of faith? We'll go to verse 8. Hopefully you have Hebrews 11 bookmarked by now. And here's what we see. By faith, Abraham. Okay, so Abraham is next in the Hall of Fame of faith. And I would say he's probably the greatest inductee into the Hall of Fame of faith. Now, I always think of Football Hall of Fame. If you were to ask most people who was the best football player who ever lived, most people would probably tell you Jerry Rice. I mean, he was so far and above better than any other receiver who played. I mean, you talk about quarterbacks, but they're even debating who was the best quarterback, or running backs, who was the best running back. But I think Jerry Rice is the consensus best player ever. Thought about throwing that question out to the church, but then I remembered how many delusional Viking fans we have in here. And so who knows what answer you would get back if you asked that question. Like, Fran Tarkenton, he's the best ever, But no, Jerry Rice. Well, I think of Abraham as the Jerry Rice of the Hall of Fame of faith. He really stands out amongst some standouts. Here's a couple reasons why I think that. One is that he gets the most coverage in the Hall of Fame of faith by a long shot. Also, when God inspired the Apostle Paul to write most of the New Testament, in 2 of his letters, to the Romans and to the Galatians, he referred to Abraham as the father of faith. Wow. That's quite a title there, the father of faith. In fact, his faith is so great and it shines through in so many ways at so many points in his life that we can't just take 1 week to look at Abraham and his vintage faith. We're actually going to take 3 weeks to look at his vintage faith, starting today. What's the first glimpse of vintage faith we get from him? Well, back to Hebrews 11:8. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as inheritance, obeyed. Well, we got that last week in Noah, that vintage faith obeys. What's so distinctive about Abraham's faith? Well, he obeyed and went, now look at this, even though he did not know where he was going. He obeyed even though he did not know where he was going. That statement right there, that gets my attention. Because I have 2 competing drives in my life. On one hand, I love to go out, I love to explore, I love to discover new places. I also like to know where I'm going. So I like to go, but I like to know where I'm going. And the truth is, if I reach the point where I no longer know where I'm going, I stop going until I can get it figured out. I think I have a healthy fear of getting lost. So I love Google Maps. Google Maps is my friend. I know you don't have to do this anymore, but still, if we're going someplace new, I will print out the directions to where I'm going. And then I will go on Google Maps and I will print a satellite image of the destination area so I have a feel for the lay of the land. Siri hasn't won me over yet. I still have some trust issues with Siri. But all this boils down to, I do not like getting lost. I like to know where I'm going. I don't like stepping out until I know beforehand where my foot is going to land. Can any of you relate to that? Do any of you like to know where you're going? Yeah. My kids, all right, if I ask them, hey, you want to come along with me? What's the first question? Where are you going? They are in no way, shape, or form inclined to go with me until they know where they're going. So, for Abraham here, to follow God's call, even though he didn't know where he was going, well, that just smacks of faith. To follow someone blindly, you have to trust them. You have to have a lot of faith in them. And to really appreciate this step of faith that Abraham took, we don't want to just look at what Hebrews 11 says. We actually want to go back to Genesis and look at his story in more detail. So go ahead and turn to Genesis chapter 11, 27th verse. That's where Abraham comes onto the scene in Scripture. And as you're turning there, let me just tell you this. At this point, Abraham is still known as Abram. Later on in Abraham's life, God will change his name. But right now, he's known as Abram. And so I use those two interchangeably. Abram, Abraham. Abram, Abraham. And I'm talking about the same person, all right? I know I'll get it wrong as we go through this today. I'll say one when I should be saying the other. Genesis chapter 11, verse 27. This is the account of Terah's family line. Terah became the father of Abram, or Abraham, like I mentioned, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran became the father of Lot. While his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans in the land of his birth. So Abram had a brother, Haran, but he died in Ur the Chaldeans, which was the land of his birth. Very likely that Abraham was born in Ur of the Chaldeans and grew up there as well. And as far as places to grow up in the ancient world, Ur of the Chaldeans was actually a pretty good place to grow up. It was a large city. It was one of the most advanced of that time. It was definitely a major trade city, so a lot of traffic, a lot of economic prosperity. Also, archaeologists unearthed a vast library from that time, so it was a hopping place. And Abraham, who was part of a wealthy family, as we're going to see, he was probably very well educated for someone at that point. So Abraham, he had two brothers, Nahor and Haran. Haran died in Ur. What happened then? Verse 29. Abram and Nahor both married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran. Ooh, okay, even that right there is weird. Haran married his niece. Nahor married his niece, Haran's daughter. So already that's an indication that Abraham didn't grow up in the best spiritual climate, all right, which speaks of his faith, that he was willing to follow God even against the grain of his own family. But Nahor had taken his niece to be his wife. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of both Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai, Abraham's wife, was childless because she was not able to conceive. Now this is a huge, huge detail that's going to play into a number of things with Abram's life going forward. But let me just say that not being able to have a child back then culturally was even more significant and more impactful then than it is now. And so file that in your brain that they weren't able to have kids. Then look at what happens, verse 31. Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur. So they're leaving Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. Okay, so where are they going? They're going to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Okay, so this is interesting. They set out for Canaan, but they ended up in Haran. Now, I like looking at the maps in my Bible, and when I looked at, okay, what does this journey look like on a map? It kind of struck me like, whoa, wait a minute. They set out from Ur to go to the land of Canaan, almost straight west, and they ended up way to the north, way up in Haran. How did that happen? That's like saying, hey, we're going to Kansas City, and we end up in Minneapolis. Excuse me. Okay, so there's a couple reasons why they probably ended up in Haran. One, if you look at that map, you see that the route they took followed the Euphrates River. And so that would be like taking an interstate highway. The roads are probably better, a lot of traffic along there, which would have made it safer. Also, you have a reliable water source the whole way. If you're going to go straight west out of Ur and go to Canaan, you got nothing but 800 miles of desert. So that's probably one reason why they went up and then they were going to come back down. Interestingly enough, 1,500 years later, a Jew by the name of Nehemiah set out from that area, Ur of the Chaldeans, to go to Jerusalem, and he pretty much took exactly the same route. But I think there was maybe another factor in here as well. You see, in Acts chapter 7, we learned that God had called Abraham to go to Canaan, not Terah the father. And so this was a case of the son convincing his dad to make this trip. And they were probably very well settled in Ur of the Chaldeans. And that was a trip fraught with risks. I mean, it wasn't all that safe to travel back then, but might also have had some implications. If this trip doesn't go well, then the will's probably going to get changed. And it's not all that unlikely that the dad would have gone, okay, well, we'll go. But they got as far as Haran and saying, that's it. I like it right here. We're going to settle right here. Haran was another hopping place economically. It was another major trade city. It was along the Euphrates. And then from a spiritual standpoint, Joshua 24:2 tells us that Terah and Nahor both worshipped idols. They were idol worshipers. Well, it just so happens that the main god in Ur of the Chaldeans was the moon god. They worshiped the moon god. Well, guess what the main god in the city of Haran was? It was the moon god as well. And so again, it probably all felt very familiar, very comfortable. So I totally understand if they reached that point and Terah said, we've gone far enough. I'm ready to settle down. We're going to stop right here unless you'd like to revisit that will again. Thank you, Abraham. And when they got to Haran, they didn't just stop. It said that they got settled. And so the Hebrew word being used there means to establish your abode. It means even to build your city or build a city as well. So they weren't pitching tents. They were building houses when they got in Haran. And they settled somewhere short of where God had called Abraham to go. Which I think should cause us to wrestle with this question. Okay, has that happened in our life? Is there something God has called us to do? And maybe we've even taken those first steps out, right? We started strong, but somewhere along the way we settled short of where God was calling us to do. Where have you settled? Well, verse 32, Terah lived 205 years and he died in Haran. And Abraham, he's going to go on and do something that's pretty radical here. Again, we're going to see in these following verses that Abraham was very, very wealthy. And he's living in a city that promises security, that promises prosperity. No doubt he's added his father's inheritance to his holding. He's living in buildings, not tents. Some of you won't even camp in tents, right? And so again, it's all very safe and secure here. But what Abraham does here is so amazing. The Bible steps back for a moment and reframes what he does. Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. The Lord had said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I will show you. So again, notice that the text says, the Lord had said. Meaning this happened in the past, probably back in Ur of the Chaldeans. Go from your country. That's what God was calling Abraham to do. And I don't even think the NIV captures it strongly enough. Go from your country. No, if you look in the King James, it says, get thee out of the country. That means, Abraham, get moving. Let's go. Let's get this show on the road. Chop, chop. Now. And where was he to go? At that point, he said he was to go to a land that I will show you. Evidently, Abraham eventually understood that was to be the land of Canaan. He'd never been there before. So he was definitely stepping out of safety and security into the unknown. But look at the reward that God offers Abraham for doing this. It says, I will make you into a great nation. That even right there was of interest to Abraham. Because remember, Abraham and Sarai, they were not able to have kids. And so for God to promise this is also a promise that you're going to have kids, Abram. And I'm sure Abraham at that point is like, okay, I'm interested. I'm in. Tell me more. And I will bless you. And God promised him, I will make your name great, which to me is a bit ironic because the chapter before in Genesis 10, God puts the kibosh on a huge construction project, the Tower of Babel. And why did he do it? He did it because the builders started that project to make a name for themselves so that their names would be great. Well, he stopped that. Why is he here offering to make Abraham's name great? Well, it's because of a principle we see all throughout Scripture. We see time and time again where God humbles the proud, but he exalts the humble. Proud, he takes them down. The humble, he lifts them up. And he must have seen humility in Abraham. He said, I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. Which again shows us God doesn't bless us just to bless us. He blesses us to bless others through us. And I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And here's the coup de grace of the whole promise. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. How in the world does God do that? How does he bless all people on the earth? Well, we're now thousands of years down the road, and we can look back and we can see how God fulfilled that. God blessed all peoples of the earth through Jesus, who was of the line of Abraham. And Jesus, he lived this sinful life, and yet he willingly laid his life down and died to pay the price for the sin of all people. And then he was raised back to life and conquered death, so that this hope was offered to all people, that if we would place our faith in him, in Jesus Christ, we could begin to know and experience real eternal life. That's how God honored that promise. But anyway, God showed up to Abraham long before, way back in Ur, and he made this promise to Abraham. Abraham had set out, but Terah, the father, said, no, we're going to get settled here in Haran, all right? By the way, when Abraham was called to leave, he was called to leave his father's household as well, but then Terah decided to go with him. It's kind of hard to leave your father's household if your father keeps following you around. And I just think that's kind of funny. But when they settled in Haran, Abraham essentially, he hit the snooze button on God's call in his life. Question now that his father's dead is, what's Abraham going to do now? Is he still going to go to Canaan? I mean, Abraham, he's pretty settled. Remember, he's in houses, not tents. And it would have been so tempting for him to think, okay, I am now the spiritual leader of this household. I get to set the pace. I get to set the course of where we're going. My father's dead. I'm the influencer. I get to chart the course. I can just follow God here. And yet God's call evidently was very clear. After Terah died, right, the alarm went off again. Verse 4. So Abram went as the Lord told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, on all the possessions they'd accumulated and the people that they'd acquired in Haran. Again, he's very wealthy. He's very well off. And yeah, he could take most of what he had with him. But Abraham, he is still trading certainty for uncertainty. He is still trading the known for the unknown. He's still trading the comfortable for the uncomfortable. He's still trading houses for tents. And yet, what evidently tipped the scales in all of this was God's calling. And they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. I think it is so cool what Abram did when he arrived. And Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. And so he didn't just cross the border, get over and go, oh, finally, I'm here, and set up camp there. No, he said, no, I'm going to tour this land that God has promised me. I want to just stroll through it. At the time, the Canaanites were in the land. I'm guessing that's why it was called the land of Canaan. Verse 7, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. Now remember that he had strolled as far as this great tree of Morah. And that's where he stopped. That's where God made this promise. That's where he built this altar. That's significant. Morah, that word means teacher. So scholars believe that this was a place of spiritual significance. This is where the Canaanites came to get direction from their gods. This is the spiritual epicenter of the land of Canaan. And yet here comes Abram, and he builds an altar to his God. That is a way of staking his claim. That is a way of putting down roots. That's his way of letting everyone know, hey, there is a new sheriff in town, my God, the one true God. Now, if you're a student of history, you know there is no way you can describe the ramifications of that one act. That one act has sent ripples through the centuries. And we are still seeing items in the headlines in the news because of Abraham doing that right there. But the lens we're looking through is, what can we learn about faith from Abraham? And from him, I think it's very plain to see that vintage faith, real faith, the kind of faith that God is looking for, it pushes us out of our comfort zone into the unknown. Abram chose following God's call over the familiar, over security, over a sure paycheck, over comfort. But again, that's what vintage faith does. And that's what God is looking for in us. We need to be willing to step out of convenience. We need to be willing to step out of comfort. We need to be willing to step out of the known into the unknown to follow him, even if we don't know where that foot is going to land. I've definitely experienced that in my life as well. I felt that same call into the unknown when God called me out of a comfortable engineering career into full-time ministry. And we felt the weight of that call some years later than when God called us out of Madison, out of our hometown, away from family, out of a church that we got to be part of starting. But he called us out of that. That was so incredibly difficult for us. And he led us to Sheridan. And we were there for 2 years, and that was shorter than we ever would have guessed. And we experienced God there, and we found that there's good people wherever you go. And we couldn't believe God was calling us out of Sheridan so soon, but he did. And the hard part about that call was he was calling us to go even though we couldn't get our house sold. Because we moved there in 2008. If you remember, for some of you, even just mention of 2008 sends shivers down your spine. Because that's when things went south economically, and the market out there went south. And we couldn't get that house sold. Yet God's calling us to leave despite that. And we followed his call to Sturgis. And we wouldn't have traded that move for the world. It was an incredible next 6 years that we spent in Sturgis. And then just as we were beginning to feel settled in Sturgis, and as we were seeing breakthrough on a number of fronts that we'd been praying for, that call into the unknown came again. And he led us here to Mitchell. Each and every one of those calls was difficult and involved tears and was scary for us. And yet there's not one of them we would look back now and we would trade that. We definitely have experienced God working in our lives through some unexpected, but through some very powerful ways because we followed him into the unknown. And we're definitely walking closer to him than we were before. It's always been worth it. And I think of our life as a church. The times where we have seen God break through and do some things are those moments where as a church we have stepped out of our comfort zone and we've stepped into the unknown. I think even this past year, when we stepped out of our comfort zone and we stepped even out of the walls of this church to offer the Family Fall Blast to the community. Hey, we ended up touching 1,600 lives through that. I think of the many in this church who've gone out and they have stepped out of their comfort zone into the unknown, even into some risky situations through short-term missions trips. And they will tell you, yeah, their faith grew through that experience. And they got closer to God than they've ever been. So I've been so excited that we've had 2 teams go to Casas for Cristo. And we had a group of people from our church go to the Ukraine this summer. And we had a group of people go to the Nepal as well. It's just, we have seen God move when we step out of our comfort zone. And a huge one was 4 years ago when this church decided to step out of its comfort zone and to rebuild this church, even though it meant meeting at the Christian school for a year and setting up and tearing down on a weekly basis. But as a result of that, God has reached many people that weren't being reached before. And this church saw its attendance grow from 410 to 570 in 2 years. Because following God's call was more important than comfort and convenience and the known. If we want to continue to see God move, it means we're going to have to continue to step out of our comfort zone and follow Him into the unknown on a personal level and as a church as well. But that's what faith does, right? That only makes sense. I have learned you can't walk in faith, yet stay in your comfort zone. Those are two contradictory ideas. So I want you to wrestle with this. What is God calling you to do? Where is He calling you to step out of your comfort zone? And this can be very broad, and I've just been praying all week, God, this is very broad. May your Spirit make this specific. So I'm just even praying right now, your hearts and minds will get tuned to what God's Spirit is saying to you. Where is He calling you out of your comfort zone? We've talked a lot today about our youth serving and the importance and how your faith can't grow if you're not serving. You can't be like Jesus if you're not serving. Maybe that's a step you need to take. Or maybe you've been coming for a while, but you've been on the fringe and you don't really know people here yet. Maybe God's calling you out of your comfort zone into a cultivate group so you can actually get to know some people at this church. So that you can begin to discover your role in us being the church that God's called us to be. Maybe He's tapping you on the shoulder saying, I want you to start saving now so you can go on one of those short-term mission trips next year. Maybe He's calling you to be more bold in the workplace with your faith, or to walk across the street and introduce yourself to the neighbor. I don't know what it is. I'm praying God's Spirit is making it clear to you right now. Where is He calling you out of your comfort zone? You can't walk in faith, yet stay in your comfort zone. It will be scary. It will cost you something. It will never be convenient. Don't wait for everything to line up perfectly. But it will always be worth it. And you will get to know God on a deeper level than you ever have before, and you will begin to make an impact for Him on a greater level than you ever have before.